In the world of chess, rules are everything. The game is governed by a strict set of guidelines that players must follow, and any deviation from these rules can have serious consequences. Even the most skilled players can find themselves in hot water if they make a mistake. This was the case in the World Blitz Championship in Moscow in 2010, where two chess titans faced off in a battle that would go down in history. One of these titans was Magnus Carlsen, the Norwegian prodigy who would go on to become the highest rated chess player of all time. Carlsen's name is synonymous with excellence in the chess world, and his natural talent and relentless work ethic have made him a force to be reckoned with. He has won numerous championships, and his mastery of the game is unmatched. The other player in this epic showdown was Boris Savchenko, a Russian grandmaster who was no stranger to high-stakes chess matches. Savchenko has faced off against many of the world's best players, including Carlsen himself, and has an ELO of 2632, so he will not be an easy opponent at all. But what happened when these two chess giants clashed in Moscow in 2010? And how can a single mistake end a long battle in losing? You can also feel that the atmosphere around the board was charged with tension, and the passionate Russian crowd added to the pressure on the players. After setting up the pieces, the game started with Magnus playing his pawn to e4. Boris played his pawn to c5, the Sicilian defense. Carlsen played his knight to e2. Boris played knight to c6. Carlsen then played his pawn to d4, attacking the central squares. Then after some exchanges, Boris played his pawn to g6, choosing the accelerated dragon variation in the Sicilian defense. Carlsen played his pawn to c4, setting what is called the Maroczy bind, which is known for putting two pawns on c4 and e4 to apply full control on the d5 square. Then, after a couple of developing moves by both players trying to put their pieces in the best squares, Boris played his queen to a5, connecting his rooks and developing the queen. Magnus played his rook to b1, keeping it away of any danger on the h8-a1 diagonal. Boris replied by bringing his rook to the semi-open c-file, and starting from this point, the game started to get more thrilling. Magnus played his pawn to f4, starting a dangerous attack on the king side. Boris played his knight to d7, clearing the way for his bishop on g7 and attacking the knight on c3. Magnus here replied slightly inaccurately by playing his knight to d5 and leaving his a2 pawn unprotected. Boris directly spotted the unprotected pawn and captured it. Magnus played b4. Boris went back with his queen. Magnus played his queen to d2, and despite being a pawn down, he seemed to have a plan. And here Boris blundered, playing his knight to f6, because after Magnus played his knight to c3, now the black queen has no square to escape to except a6, which would result for him losing his knight after Magnus advanced his pawn to b5. Realizing this, Boris decided to keep the position unbalanced as much as possible by sacrificing his knight, so he played the knight and took the pawn on e4. Then, after a couple of moves where both players moved their forces around, the position was seemingly comfortable for Magnus, until this move where Boris played his pawn to d5, attacking the white knight on e4. And instead of retreating to c3, Magnus played an inaccurate move, knight to f2. And here Boris missed a big chance, which was advancing the pawn to d4, trapping the bishop on e3. Instead, he exchanged pieces. And after a couple of moves and exchanges, the white position seemed to be winning, having an extra piece for only two pawns. But it wasn't an easy task at all regarding the time pressure for both players. Boris played f5 to prevent the white knight from engaging into the game through the e4 square. Magnus started to bring his king into the game, and so did Boris after a couple of moves. At this point, the game continued on the track of victory for white, and suddenly Magnus played the inaccurate move rook to c2. The seemingly normal move hid behind it a beautiful blow that Boris spotted here, rook to b3. The move has a tactical feature behind it. Now it appears that white can't simply take the free rook on b3 because black will retake with the pawn on c4. And if white fell in the trap and took the rook on c8, black will play his pawn to b2 to queen his pawn the next move, and white can do nothing about that. And after Magnus realized that, he played his rook to d1, to which Boris replied by taking the pawn on b5. The position is now equal, with black having 3 pawns in return for white's extra piece. Notably, 2 of black's pawns are connected passed pawns, which adds to their strength. Players kept moving their pieces, and after some simplifications, we reached a completely equal endgame, where Magnus has a rook against a bishop and 2 pawns. And all of a sudden, Magnus messed up and played a blunder, king to d4. The problem is that Boris now will give him a check with the bishop from f2 and take the rook. And after Carlsen realized that, he took the king again and played it 2 somewhere else. But actually, in professional chess, this is considered an illegal move, because we have a rule that whenever your hand leaves the piece, you can't change your mind and play it somewhere else. As both players realized that, Carlsen stopped the clock and resigned, announcing Boris as the winner of this battle.